And over a period of time, a bodybuilding lifespan, if you function better, you will, it's not a, you, it's, this is non-negotiable. You will make more progress. And there's a good handful of pros right now. Like I have a lot of the coaches I work with and stuff, either it's their clients and we worked on them or they know them from their gym or whatever. There's a good handful of guys right now, like I can tell you straight up that are could do so much better if they would just learn this methodology or work with someone that knew how to manage it. But again, they just want to know what drugs to take and how much of them to take. And I'm like, it all has a time, it all has a place, but you have to understand the body's a system. Like we can't just cram a square peg into a round hole forever and expect to keep making progress. And then what happens? They get burnt out, they quit, they say bodybuilding sucks and it's fucking stupid, no one should do it. And
In today's episode of AMA Podcast with Chris and Milos. Milos today is with clients, so it's going to be Austin Stout and I. Austin Stout is a very intelligent individual. He specializes in functional nutrition, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is exactly and how that can help and apply to bodybuilding, performance, general health, and of course, quality of life. Austin, man, what's going on?
not much, man. Another busy day.
Yeah, dude, I have to say, man, I'm pretty excited to have you on here. I know a lot of viewers probably have seen you start to come about. Your name's kind of circulating around in the whole functional nutrition aspect of things, and that's gaining more popularity. And obviously, we're going to touch on that. But I needed to have you on to kind of go more depth because, you know, a lot of the old school bodybuilders, and, you know, there's nothing wrong with the way they prep, but we know that there are quite a high percent of people that have a lot of issues that generally are just not going to be fixed with throw a prebiotic at it, throw a probiotic at it, and then just train harder, do more cardio, more T3 and get lean. So I figured we would kind of touch a little bit on that. Now, for the viewers, man, I want you to kind of just give you a synopsis of one, what got you into bodybuilding? And two, you can skip kind of over to like the interest in the approach you started to take with what you take now, right?
Sure.
I mean, you get a lot. We all jump in probably prepping people nutrition from the education we had, and of course our experiences with other coaches. And then sure enough, we start to learn information on our own and apply with the problems we see with ourselves and of course our own clients. So go ahead, Austin.
Yeah, man. So I'm in kind of an interesting position because I started early enough where I had exposure to forums and and all the old school stuff, right? But I'm also young and not as stubborn as some of the other people, so I was open-minded enough to see the newer stuff that was coming about as well, which is kind of where we're at now. So I've been able to kind of bridge the gap between the two. I started bodybuilding, I don't know, when I started actually competing, my first competition was 2009, I think, was the first year, and of course I started probably a few years before that, mainly for sports, wrestling. And then what I found was most of the information that I could find on nutrition was all from bodybuilding publications. Like there was nothing else that seemed to be useful. So that's where I gravitated towards that. And when I finished up with that, with wrestling, I decided I went right into my first competition prep, basically, which in hindsight probably wasn't good after like the intensive wrestling season. And then now I would never do that now, but that's how you learn. So kind of fast forward, I competed different levels over the years, most recently at NPC Nationals last year. And
And you look
kind of
awesome.
thank you. I appreciate that, man. Yeah, I kind of worked my way up the ladder there, the old school way, have done the junior shows, all that stuff. But I would say probably around 2011, 12, 13, right in that area, I started having my own functional health issues in terms of low hormones, not recovering from prep, typical stuff that we see pretty commonly. And at the time, we were kind of getting into like people were tracking macros and doing that kind of thing, right? But we weren't really into the whole blood work, um, especially not into GI and into, things like Dutch testing and any of that, not even close yet. But my doctor Dr. Eric Serrano, who I'm sure you know that name, turned me on to Dutch testing actually. And I had one pretty early on. It was literally the pamphlet that the Dutch test people from Analytical had handed out in the office. He's like, I have this new test. I want you to try it based on your symptoms. And so I did it. I was super, super fucked up essentially. And that kind of led me down this path of digging into this space. And when I started digging into hormones and metabolism of hormones and learning, I'm like, oh wow, there's a digestive component to this. There's an adrenal component to this. Like this stress is this whole big thing. And then over the years, I didn't really ever market as functional health. I just started kind of plugging stuff in to people's programming because I saw this biofeedback. I'm like, I can make this a little better, this a little better. And then, of course, now where we're at is a lot of people are doing this, and some people that's all that they do is just that. And I still do a lot of both. I have anywhere from like your worst of the worst functional cases clear up to just IFBB pro bodybuilder, just kind of everything in between, which that's what I enjoy just because I think that more exposure to different situations just kind of fine tunes my craft and gives me different scenarios to work through. I know like some people really like to niche themselves. Like I work with all pros or all bikini or all moms. And I don't think I really have a preference, to be honest. Like my only preference is just clients that I jive with, really is the only thing that I care about, to be honest.
You couldn't have said it better. And one thing I want to throw in, insert there before you continue is I can see eye to eye when I have a client who comes to me and I get them in shape and it's super easy and they're peeled and they win. Yeah, that's satisfying, but I'm
Sure.
not looking at them like that was an accomplishment, right? Even
Right.
if they did win a national championship, it's like, okay, that's cool. But you take a guy and you look at their body and you're like, oh no, like this guy's pretty in rough shape and you're way too high in body fat, digestive issues, not responding, and then you work with them over 6 months to a year and you get them to respond, and all of a sudden they're eating 1.5 times food 4 weeks out than they were at 18 weeks out, looking better, harder, their digestion's better, and they end up getting second in a show they wanted to win. They looked at nuts because you learned a lot along the way with problem solving. I'm like you now, where I used to stress me out, but now I'm looking at it at a different light because now I have more of the
Yeah.
knowledge and the tools to do it.
Yeah, so you probably saw my guy that won North Americans last year, won the overall Felix, that super heavy. That was kind of him. He came in, had a good amount of muscle, lots of GI issues, just was kind of doing eating as much as he could, basically old school, strong guy, right? And it was really cool. He had aspirations to be an IFBB pro. And when we started, I was like, maybe, right? But there was so many things that needed to be worked on, and fast forward, he gets to we finally get there. COVID screwed us up the first time. Then he did USA's and got third the first national show, and then did North Americans. But long story short, that was an example of like taking a bigger bodybuilder, right? I would say open men's super heavyweights kind of the pinnacle of bodybuilding, right? Assuming
Podium
that they're
kind of.
not just a sloppy super heavy, and fixing GI, getting inflammation down, like getting him digesting food, and reducing, like even fine tuning supplementation. It was amazing to see what he responded to when we actually got him functioning good, you know? So, um, that's been really cool. I love bodybuilding, so my heart's still there. But I love taking these guys that I'm like, man, you got a lot of potential, but we can fix all this stuff, and you're going to respond so much better.
And it's funny. It's that's just it. Is you get people, and it's good that they're coachable because I know you already know when people are like, oh, but coach, we got to push, we got to do this. It's like, listen, if your appetite and digestion's not there and inflammation's high, you're not going to be able to get where you need to go. Doesn't matter what drugs you take, how hard you train, how much food you take intake, it's not going to work. You got to make sure that foundation and everything's operating well because you're going to end up getting in a worse and worse situation, you know?
Yeah, and because what are the issues we generally run into in our sport? We run into in bodybuilding, especially with men, there's about 2 to 3 main issues: cardiovascular, renal, and they can't eat enough, right? That's it. Like those are the main things. There's a longevity component in one of those three or all three of those areas. And if we can lower inflammation, a lot of the renal and cardiovascular access issues start to go down, right? And a lot of that inflammation is actually stemming from GI, because I know we want to talk about that today. A lot of that inflammation is actually stemming from food, from massive amounts of food, from eating 500 grams of protein from nothing but like beef and rice for 10 years straight
I,
and no microbial diversity in the gut at all.
thank you. I'm so happy. You have no idea how excited I am to talk about this because, Austin, I don't know if I'll give you a quick story. I want you to talk the most on this, but I had ulcerative colitis. Were you aware of that at all?
Yeah, I think I've seen that. Yep.
Yeah. So, like, real quick, going back to 2013, getting ready for North Americans, I was going through divorce, finishing my master's, a lot of stress and prepping. Just,
Yeah, of
the old
course.
school mindset, push,
Naturally,
push,
right?
push, 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 push.
Right.
And then I remember like getting gassy during training or when I would exert myself hard, my stomach felt like it was going to pop. I'm like, that's weird. Then I'm like in the middle of my workouts, all of a sudden I'd run to the bathroom. I'm like, I might have to shit or have gas. And then I would just fart air and a little bit of mucus. And then all of a sudden I started to get worse and worse and worse. And then one day I go to the bathroom. I'm like, oh, I'm just going to go fart air. And I go, I'm like, oh, it's weird. I had diarrhea. I look in the toilet, it's completely full of blood.
Right.
And I'm like, what the hell? And then it was just like 14 times a day. And dude, I went through the whole entire prep with it and just kept going anyway, like an idiot. But long story short, I don't have it anymore. I've had 3 colonoscopies. My last colonoscopy showed 0 evidence of any type of IBD at all. And he looks at me and he looks at my first colonoscopy and he goes, dude, you had characteristics of Crohn's and ulcerative colitis,
Right.
according to this gastroenterologist. He goes, looking at your gut, this doesn't look like the same person. And he started to ask about my history because this was a new doctor. And I go, no, man, like, well, first off, I removed myself from bodybuilding. I did change the diet, more diverse foods over time, follow the FODMAP at first, then eventually bring foods back in, stay with the problematic foods, cycle more the foods to get that healthy gut microbiome back. I still, to this day, though, if I'm lack of sleep, very, very poor stress management, high anxiety, I get signs, right?
Get some
GI starts to be
flare up.
upset.
Yeah.
I know to pull back, but I don't have any signs or symptoms anymore. I'm completely clean. And then
Right.
I've been prepping now for this module that I'm doing, and my digestion's flawless. But this is a common thing we see in bodybuilding all the time right now. Like digestion is a major issue, and there's a lot of people with IBD, colitis, like signs and symptoms, and they don't have any family history at all.
Yeah, because it's self-created, right? When we talk, so we could kind of talk about some terms a little bit. So IBD would be inflammatory bowel disease, and that would colitis, like colitis, diverticulitis, all this stuff really means is like where the inflammation is located within the
Yep.
GI tract, right? But in reality, if it's there long enough, it's going to be the whole GI tract. We're talking gastritis, which is stomach. We're talking colitis, colon, like this whole intestinal tract, stomach, everything's going to be inflamed. And then, of course, what else do we end up with bodybuilders? Lots of acid reflux, right? And also because our acid demands are already high because we eat this copious amounts of food and all this protein and stuff. And then on top of that, so this cascade starts happening, right? And then on top of that, we have no microbial diversity because we're eating the same 4 foods all the time, right? And then we end up with what that term dysbiosis, right? And then this is where those overgrowths come in. So overgrowths would be, people probably heard like the term SIBO potentially. Um, all these things really mean is that the the bacteria has kind of migrated to the wrong places, and also the bad stuff outgrows the good stuff, and that's essentially what happens. And that's where like a lot of the gas symptoms happen, because these bacteria create gas. So like an actual SIBO test, because we use like GI map, which is a stool test, but there's also a breath test with SIBO, which literally tests gas, hydrogen and methane gas coming out in your breath,
Right.
right?
So you ever smell some bodybuilders' breaths? You're like, oh my God.
There's some I've run into that, dude, from like 5 feet away. I'm like, dude, what the hell?
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
so and I've had plenty of my own GI issues too. And again, like I said, most of the stuff is because I've screwed up and done all this to myself at one point in time. And don't get it twisted. If you are a bodybuilder and you want to gain muscle and you have to eat a lot of food, it's it's not a matter of, it's not always going to be a perfect scenario. It's just learning about management and learning when to pull back and when to correct things.
Yes.
And like I said earlier, a lot of people's off seasons and muscle gain gets cut short, especially as they advance more because they can't eat enough, right? They just can't digest food anymore. So yeah, I mean, that's what we're
Well,
running into.
touching that, Austin, you just said that, like, people need to understand that it's not something that you fix and it's never gonna be a problem ever again. It's something that you have to manage, like you said, knowing when to pull back,
Yeah, yeah.
when to make corrections, etc. And you know what's funny? The gastroenterologist, the first one, said to me, I told him I have no family history of any type of GI disorder at all. I have no Jewish ancestry either. And I go, I'm not really under a lot of stress or stress events other than me pushing myself with my diet and bodybuilding. And he goes, there's no evidence of that. He goes, you didn't do it yourself. That's what he said to me. And he
Okay.
also told me that no matter how much I change my diet, I'm not going to be able to fix what I'm going to fix. Like,
Right.
listen, man, like, I am a dietitian. So, like, I did go to school. I understand what you're saying, but that doesn't really align with what I learned, even though we didn't learn a ton about the gut microbiome in my undergrad. We did a little bit in my master's, but like, I kind of said to him, like, I can't believe they're being taught that, right? And he gave
Right.
me like the strong anti-inflammatory suppository,
Yeah,
which was
yeah.
like $1,200 a month. Insurance didn't cover it, and it didn't do anything. It did
Right.
nothing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to hear the doctor say that. And for people who are listening, I'm not saying don't listen to your doctor, but they're all alternative ways to help restore your gut microflora.
Yeah. So we again are running into, like I said, dysbiosis, inflammation, and a lot of these things are inevitable to an extent. So what's important to understand is that what do we need to do to mitigate those, and when should we pull back? And when we do pull back, for example, like when you're in an off season, if you have like an extended off season and you do a mini cut or like a cleanup phase or whatever people want to call it, um, that's a good time to work on your gut, make sure that you're prepared for the next phase, for example. Um, so things that I do with people, if we can talk really baseline stuff, and I this might sound baseline, but most people don't even do this
I know.
if
Yeah.
bodybuilders are listening, is literally diversifying your diet and understanding macronutrient breakdowns. So eating, and this is something I've experimented more over the years, eating 400 or 500 grams of protein works for very few people for very long. And we have so much research on protein now that shows us that our muscle protein synthesis occurs maximally in a lot of different, varying ranges of protein. So what we need is
And your
not
body
really probably
adapts.
right, for sure. And plus, we can always replace with other macronutrients, carbohydrates and fat, which are going to be inherently protein sparing anyhow, right? So first off, just understanding that, because what's happening again is digestive demands and acid demands are going up so high that you can't digest all this food, and then transit time starts slowing down. So kind of what happens is we don't have enough acid to break everything down. So then we end up with intra-abdominal pressure. That's that peristalsis. So like all those muscles that are trying to like churn this food, they're overacting, and that creates that pressure. And that's where that like blown out, the blown out stomach comes from, right? On top of just being full, of course. And then with that, that's where a lot of that reflux kind of starts, because that esophageal flap gets popped open, right? From all that pressure. So stuff's like splashing up in the esophagus over and over again. And when all that food just sits in there and that transit's really slow, or that motility is really slow, bacterial fermentation starts to pick up, pick up, pick up, pick up. Then you get that overgrowth, right? So then over time, we end up with, you know, GERD or acid reflux, bacterial overgrowth, and then eventually inflammation, because the body's trying to like attack all of this, and all these insults and injuries to your GI tract.
Yeah,
So
training sucks. Recovery starts to suck.
right. And so you talked about stress. So I think this is, if you knew nothing at all other than just vary your foods and mitigate your lifestyle, stress is by far the number one component. It doesn't matter if you're a bodybuilder, it doesn't matter if you're a soccer mom coming off the street trying to fix their digestion, because as you know, digestion is a parasympathetically driven process, right? Rest and digest.
Yeah.
Training is sympathetic. Um, Life stressors are sympathetic. Lacking sleep is going to make you more sympathetically driven, right? It's going to raise your cortisol. It's going to raise that response. So what does that do? That transit slows down more and more and more and more and more. That's why you hear things like sit down, chew your food, take your time, when you eat, because all those things will help with that parasympathetic response. Um, and man, I tell you, in bodybuilding, it's interesting because I have such opposite ends of the spectrum. I've got really stressed bodybuilders and really stressed like moms or parents that come off, our gen pop. Bodybuilders are normally really stressed because they train really hard. That's one. That's kind of inevitable, and we have to do that, right?
That self-pressure.
Right. The second one is bodybuilders are like so hyper vigilant and OCD that they're just constantly driving stressors. And it's so bad now because we can track everything. We're like blood glucose 4 times a day and tracking our HRV and let's looking at our watches and writing all this
It
fucking
adds to that
biofeedback and
stress and
shit down.
anxiety. Yeah.
Dude, so you have that. And that's why I've even found some of my, I don't know if I want to use the word dumb, but some of my lesser educated people are far easier to work with because they don't worry about any of that shit. They just listen to what I say, they follow the program, they don't overthink it, and in turn, digestion's better, performance is better.
Two things I want to share quick. It's like the people who are over analytical and they get lost in the details. And those people tend to have more of a desire to control everything. When they can't, they're harder to work with and more resistant to change. But one thing I want to insert a back couple sentences when you're stating about the high protein, the stress, the sleep, is you look at what bodybuilders tend to fall into as far as the dogmatic processes of got to use high trenbolone, clenbuterol, T3, stimulants, pre-workouts. Why is this trend so low? I mean, these are all ultimate things that are going to affect digestion, sleep, stress the body, everything altogether. The recent cut I just did, I use zero tren, zero fat burners, zero stimulants. Digestion, sleep is flawless. And that's in my body. I'm not doing any cardio either, getting ripped. And that's not everybody, but I notice even myself with some of the things I've worked with some of my clients is keeping trenbolone very low, using stimulants seldomly, if at all, cycling clen if they have to pull back to get them more sleep, and discontinuing clenbuterol or abstaining from stimulants and kind of going for leisurely walks as cardio to kind of calm the body, listen to music. And all of a sudden they're like, dude, I'm down 4 pounds in 2 days of rest. I don't understand. And my digestion's back. I'm not constipated anymore. It's because you're everything that their brain is following with that dogmatic process of like, oh, 8 weeks out, you have to do this. We have to cycle this and bring this up and bring this up. All contributes to that very point. Now, the listeners, some people can get away with that and their stomach's never going to fall apart. But that's not honestly everybody. And honestly, I don't even think that's 50% of people.
No, I think it's more like it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when
Age
eventually
too. Yep.
you have issues. And when we talk about PEDs, fat burners, anything, everything's kind of a inverted U. It works better until it doesn't, right? Like nothing versus a little bit's going to work better than nothing, right?
Right.
And a little more than that's probably going to work a little bit better. But if we get up here, right, then we're going to start running into systemic stress. That's why when you take someone, off season, for example, and you're pushing up those high systemically stressful drugs, whether it's trenbolone or like orals that are methylated that are stressing the liver, that's why you start noticing more GI issues. They are stressing the liver, bile production's compromised. They often cause like a histamine response, which is kind of like an allergic response to the drug and to that system being stressed. And then you end up with GI issues. It's like you see on Facebook, hey, I'm taking this, this, and this, and I'm getting acid reflux. How do I fix it? I'm like, lower it. And
Yeah.
then you can digest your food again. And now you're going to grow. Like what you're doing right now is not, is not
You know,
helping you.
how do you combat the whole mentality of, I'm sure people will message you and be like, instead of asking, what do I need to change with my diet or my cycle? Hey, Austin, what prebiotic and probiotic and digestive enzyme can I load up on to mitigate my issue? Well, it's like, well, one, we don't know if that's even your issue. And two, it's probably not going to fix anything.
Right. So I like to, of course, every coach is going to come in and have some kind of consultation process they're going to do with people. So to collect information. So when I'm looking at it, if it is some kind of systemic stress or total stress load is high, I'll be honest, first thing I'm doing is looking for path of least resistance with people. I'm like, what are the things I can fix right now that are going to give us the most bang for our buck? And then I'll work into the more abrasive, harder conversations as we go. Now, that's not everyone because sometimes people are so far out to left field or in such bad shape that I'm like, listen, we got to do this right now.
Yeah.
Right. So I got to kind of pick and choose my battles in that regard. But when they're coming in, I'm usually, like I said, I'm usually looking at diet because diversity in the diet is very poor. Sometimes we need to come in and make the diet easier to digest. When we talk easier to digest, we're talking foods that are going to move through the system quickly. So that's going to be carbohydrates that are easy to digest, controlling fiber intake, not eating 500 grams of protein a day, picking fat sources that are easier to digest. So, like monounsaturated fat oils, things that are going to move through you quicker than just purely animal fats all the time. Doing those things rather than like blending your fucking steak and chicken all the time. Like like, we can just fix your food selection instead, and then we'll start to be able to digest food. Next thing I'm looking at is probably in bodybuilders especially is probably those acid requirements because a lot of them again, even when you do drop that protein some, we're still running into pretty high acid demand, so we can support that. So this is where medical community is really hurting men, especially because men have a lot more acid reflux than women statistically. Is what do they prescribe? They prescribe proton pump inhibitors or some kind of antacids. And essentially, for those that don't know, what a proton pump inhibitor does is it's causing the cells that produce acid to stop producing acid, or at least reduce the amount of acid they're producing. And it helps control that esophageal flap pressure. So initially you get relief because now you're not getting reflux splashing up into your throat because that flap's not popping open. But in turn, your acid's going down and down and down and down, and you end up with that bacterial overgrowth because stuff's sitting in your stomach. So that relief that you got initially, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. You're going to backtrack over time. These issues are low acid, not high acid. And the reason for that again is because our acid demands are so high. A really great example I like to use is think of a teenager. Teenagers can literally eat whatever they want. Usually they don't have acid reflux and they can digest everything and they're hungry all the time. That's because acid production drops as you age, right?
I remember eating
Yeah.
whatever.
Because if that was the case, then every teenager on the planet would have acid reflux and would be bloated all the time. And that's not the case because this production is dropping more and more and more as you age. So if you're 35, 40, 45, 50, and you're eating 400 or 500 grams of protein a day, or maybe sometimes even less, for some people can't even handle close to that, then you're going to end up with those acid issues. So that's probably kind of the second thing that I'm looking at with a lot of those folks before I get into like the overgrowth side of things.
So you will, if they're open to it, you immediately try to bring the protein down a little bit, and maybe change out some of the proteins, maybe not so much red meat if they're eating so much red meat in a day. Because most of
Yeah.
the time I'm finding when people are eating red meat, they're adding taco seasoning. They're adding things that tend to be a little more on the acidic, spicy, reflux stimulating side to that red meat, pepper, etc. So that's something that for sure. But do you drop protein right away? Because like I can tell you right now, I'm a lower protein guy. Like I end up ranging, you could say 1.25 grams per pound of body weight if they're a reasonable body fat. That's probably my average. And then at the most 1.5, and that's usually in a situation where they are in a calorie deficit. But I've never been one to push protein to 400 or 500 grams of people. I don't ever think it's necessary. I've never seen it. I don't believe it. What's your take on, how you approach some of your clients with that, and also preventing this from happening?
Yeah, I think in that probably 1 to 1.5 range, depending on the person, is going to be pretty applicable to most. Um, and same thing with women. That's going to be plenty, especially for enhanced people, because what people don't realize is they're like, well, PEDs raise protein synthesis. I'm like, yeah, but they also slow down protein turnover at the same time. I'm like, you're kind of making a moot point, because yes, they could potentially increase the synthesis and nitrogen retention, but they're also decreasing the amount of breakdown, right? So I'm like, I don't know that that really proves anything necessarily,
Yeah,
right?
it's in theory.
Sure. So with that, I would much prefer to take that kind of typical bodybuilding off-season diet. High protein, high carbohydrate. The fats that they're getting are normally just from the protein sources, and they maybe add like some fish oils or something in during the day. If you're lucky, they'll do like a little bit of essential fats coming in from some nut butters or like an avocado or something, right? And I'm stretching here because I'm not even getting that most of the time. And so again, we can strip that protein down to that minimum, which is going to be that probably 1 to 1.25 for most people. That's going to be plenty. I can bring carbohydrate up. I'm positioning carbohydrate strategically in the sense that I want stuff that digests easy. So like I can leverage intra workout more with people if I need to. We're talking high molecular weight carbs that digest very quickly. Even doing things like fruits that are like low to moderate FODMAP fruits that aren't going to bloat you. We can run those with a lot of people. They digest really easy. Of course, people already eat kind of higher glycemic, like most people like white rice. A lot of people eat brown rice anymore. But doing things like white rice, maybe some white potato, utilizing carb powders. I'll even use like a little bit of fruit juice in people's diets, a little bit of orange juice supplemented in here and there, things like that. And we just get that digestion moving and moving and moving. Then we increase that acidity, increase that acid environment to get it to where we need to, so where that reflux is going away. And now all of a sudden they're like, I'm hungry every 2 hours instead of four, right? Now I'm like not hungry. Before I wasn't even hungry when my next meal came 3 hours later, and now I'm ready to eat in an hour and a half, right? Because now motility's moving. Motility's moving. Now, fortunately, I'd be lying if I said that you could just do that with everyone and all their problems would be solved, because unfortunately some people are so
Oh
far
yeah.
gone that there's going to be a lot more intervention needed.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, and that's one thing, listeners, you guys got to hear. Like, there's obviously a synopsis, and you can follow Austin's stuff, and he talks more about it, and he offers classes. But it's true. I mean, I went through it myself with what I had to go coming out of my ulcerative colitis, and then restoring it. And I have to say, dude, it's weird to go to the limited diet that I was on during my massive flare-ups, to me being able to eat raw broccoli now with no problems,
Mhm.
and normal foods that would typically trigger me, cause gas, bloating, digest perfectly fine. Even some high FODMAP foods. There's still some foods I have to stay away from. They just don't operate well with me.
Sure.
But now that I have that gut microflora, my stomach's flat. I'm hungry. I everything's just better. But it took time, and it takes management. Management is something I'm just gonna have to continue to do on my own. And of course, as you stated before, when things start to kind of arise, knowing when to pull back and kind of restore it, because once that gut microflora is restored, it doesn't permanently stay that way, because you
You can
obviously can
break it
mess it
again.
up. Yeah, break it
Yeah.
again in the off season or in prep.
Yeah.
Now, tell me this, and this is something that has been open to discussion a lot, is the rigors of preparation in the gut and the stress, because obviously preparation for a show does put the body through a ringer. There's not
Yeah.
many people that's going to go through a contest prep, finish it, feel wonderful, it was easy, they feel awesome,
Not if you
and
get in shape.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So like there's some people that can, get in shape with minimal damage, but the gut microflora is going to be affected through contest prep.
Yeah.
And that's something that is unavoidable, but it's also something that can be managed to hold on for dear life until after the show. Is there anything that you particularly found useful on managing that as you're pushing somebody harder and harder, and they're in the last like 4 weeks,
Sure.
androgens are higher, they're probably not sleeping as well, and how, besides the typical pulling back, allowing rest, is there anything that's kind of like stood out in your mind that you've kind of implemented with your clients over the years?
Well, first is always go into the prep in a good position. That seems kind of like an obvious thing, but if you're already have one foot out the door before you start, good luck. Of
Yeah, forget
course,
it.
you're gonna be in a bad, and that goes for any type of health issue at all, right? Of course. Um, you mentioned something really important there too in the pulling back thing. So I think that throughout prep, something I've done differently with people is you remember years ago when everyone was starting to talk about refeeding more, right? We were starting to understand the importance of that. Like people were moving a little away from the free meal and into like the refeed scenario. And I did that. Like, of course, people are like, cool, I can eat this all these carbs and stuff, and I can, people were pushing the refeeds and figuring out, man, we can do these huge refeeds and things, right? But what I figured out a lot over the years was I like to use those refeeds as more of stress mitigation. So instead of just feeding someone more, I would rather feed them moderately, but pull back on each of those refeeds. So, like doing things like refeeding on non training days, pulling cardio out for entire days, stuff like that, rather than just saying, eat this extra food. How about we eat a little bit of extra food and pull this stress down, right? Because a lot of what we see in the refeeds is like, of course, leptin goes up a little bit, thyroid hormone conversion goes up a little bit. A lot of what you're getting when you drop weight is just inflammation. It's just cortisol is dropping down. So that's a great tactic to prep. The food variety is super important in prep too, because of course, when calories are limited, we're limited on things that we can eat because what we can grab for is certainly going to go down and down and down, especially if you have to get really low calories. So something that I do with people is if I'm building out a plan, is I'm making it known that food rotation is going to be a part of the plan. So if they have meal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever it is, each one may have a couple different proteins, couple different starches, couple different fruits, da 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 da. And of course, each meal might not be 100% different, but we have options to rotate through in those meals. And it's non-negotiable thing that we have to rotate throughout the prep and the off season too, of course, and continue to do that. And then with bodybuilders, um, other things we're doing is those those acid requirements are going to go down because of course you're eating less. So we have that. Liver support is going to be super important for people also because especially if we're adding like methylated orals and things in that are stressing that out, because liver is going to be important for bile production, bile flow, bile production. So another component, especially for fat digestion. So supporting, like I like to use TUDCA a lot with people, a lot of NAC, a lot of NAC, which will raise glutathione levels, support liver. Um, I'll use D-limonene with people sometimes, which will help those bile ducts stay nice and clean and function well. Um, TUDCA is really awesome. I think people make a mistake, though. They don't use enough. A lot of the clinical research shows that a lot of the good stuff happens at a pretty high dose for like 1,000, 1,250, 1,500. So you have to dose it pretty frequently. It's pretty expensive, unfortunately. Um, and then also same thing with the macronutrient breakdowns in prep. A lot of people will want to all of a sudden jack their protein up, twice the amount when they go into prep. I'm like, no, we're going to probably keep it pretty similar. And we're probably going to leverage, because also, like, I would much rather leverage energy substrates. Like, protein's probably not going to
Oh,
give me that much energy, right?
it's such a breath of fresh air to hear you say that.
Like, I would much rather leverage carbs and fat, which are actual energy substrates for me or for the client during that prep period. Like, why, if I can have them on 225 grams of protein and eat more carbs and fat, of course their performance is going to be better, their digestion is going to be better, they're going to feel better. And then biggest thing, lifestyle wise in prep too, is just, you mentioned some good things about stimulants. I think that's important. Really just like understanding half-life of stimulant. is a pretty important thing. Like clenbuterol, for example, is in your system a really, really long time. So if you're taking 120 micrograms of clen in the morning, that's some of that's still going to be in your system. And even though you're dead ass tired and you're going to fall asleep, that sleep's going to be super broken. You're popping up and down, you're rolling over, you're sweating all night, all that shit. So figuring out dose response. So like when I'm adding in fat loss supplements with people, if it is, clenbuterol, we'll go 20, we'll go 40, we'll go 60, and they're like, sleep's starting to improve. I'm like, don't go up anymore. Stop. Because that extra 0.5% of BMR increase is not going to outweigh that, their digestion going to shit and their sleep going to shit. It's not going to do anything for me and for
Yeah,
them.
and one thing I want to insert too, you said something very interesting prior to that about the refeeds, and people have a misconception these refeeds stimulate all this fat loss and you lose a bunch of weight. And as Austin said, it's true. Research doesn't support the amount of metabolism increase is going to equate for fat loss. It's really just rinsing off the inflammation. Your body lowers cortisol. You drop the water that's masking that fat loss that you did have, and ultimately also, and when it gives you a energy mental boost, you end up moving more the next 3 days. And
Sure.
that really is what kind of drives those calories. But instead of going from one extreme to the other, which I totally agree with, it's too much for the gut, right? You're
Yeah.
going way up, way down, where versus just moderately having your calories higher for a little bit, pulling back maybe on the failure sets or the intensity, let the sympathetic nervous system chill out and then go back at it again, mitigate that fatigue, is so much better for digestion, fat loss, sleep, recovery, everything, and everything goes better. And just like you said with stimulants, there's too much emphasis sometimes on trenbolone, clen, T3, all these things that they're going to get you shredded when, like you said before, it works to the point where it doesn't, and then it starts to go the other way.
Right.
And you utilize these tools based on the individual response, not just being like week one, it's all written out for the whole entire prep. People, what's 2 weeks out gonna look like? I don't know. I don't even know what 2 days to live from now is gonna look like. It's all based on how your body responds, and if you get through at the end with very little, then that's great. And I love how you said too about the protein being lower. You rather have other substrates that's going to give you more energy to train. And I had this conversation with my clients just actually 2 days ago. Chris, aren't I going to lose muscle eating such little protein in prep? I go, let me tell you something. He goes, I lowered your protein and I gave you more carbohydrates. Did you feel better? Oh yeah, training's been awesome. Okay. Would you safe to say, probably in theory, that you're expending more calories now that you're training harder? He goes, oh, I could easily say that. I'm like, okay, so if you're training harder and you feel better and you're stronger, you're more in an environment to retain more muscle than you would be if you were fatigued, eating higher protein, regardless of the same calories, feeling worse. Because if your training starts to deteriorate, ultimately in time, that's more favorable environment for muscle loss and you looking flatter. So
100%.
why wouldn't you want to eat in a way, regardless of
Yeah.
what dogma says about what protein we should be at or whatever? If this is the response you're having, then
Yeah.
you let it rip.
Yeah. And training is another good thing we can kind of touch on too, in that it's a mistake that people make with training and also with PEDs, is that what is the goal of prep? For most people, unless you're just dicking around in the off season doing nothing, then it's muscle retention, right? Like the idea of growing into a show happens either in very select few freaky people that respond to PEDs well, or ones that just dick around in the off season and don't actually make progress, right? And what we do know is that with training and with PEDs, for example, is that the threshold you need to maintain muscle is way lower than the threshold you need to actually grow muscle, and way lower. So training, like we're talking about training volume, like training and prep should be efficient. It should be to maintain strength in movements where you can within, don't be a dumbass about it, obviously, and get yourself hurt, but maintaining muscle where you can, fatigue management, understanding that like you can like take a couple days off as a deload and prep here and there if you need to, if it serves you well. And those things are going to help. When I see people that are trying to like get stronger all the way up until a week out in prep, I'm wondering two things. Either there's no way I could do that, for one, because I train really hard in the off season and there's no way that I'm going to be stronger at trying to squeeze into light heavies than I am weighing 240 pounds. There's just no way it's not going to happen, no matter what I'm taking.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. So for me, I'm thinking like, where can I maintain strength? How can I set myself up to, fatigue management? Also like movement selection, when we're talking about prep. So if you're a big guy and you're strong, then going into the gym and doing like 4 multi-joint movements to absolute failure and a whole shitload of sets that's just literally going to smash your nervous system to absolute smithereens, rather than like picking a multi-joint movement that you can probably maintain your strength and maintain that bracing, and picking brace movements that you can contract the muscle and focus on what you're doing and not create a ton of unnecessary systemic fatigues. I'm not telling people to just go do easy shit all the time, but you got to understand that that threshold is just not where people think it is.
Yeah. So he means like a chest supported row at that point in preparation versus a bent over barbell row. You're going to be still loading the back, stimulating the back, but you're going to be mitigating some of the fatigue involved with the spinal load.
Right.
Maybe not doing deadlifts and squats and barbell row in the same week, right?
Right.
Where you're loading up the body too much. Yeah, I get that with my clients too. And it's funny, sometimes they'll say to me, dude, I'm getting stronger. I'm like, okay, listen to me. I'm okay with that. I'm not going to tell you to train
Sure.
like a pussy, but
Absolutely.
I really don't want you lifting heavier loads. If you can do more reps, I'm cool with that. But just please leave it at that. Because if all of a sudden your mechanics start to improve because your stomach's down, you could deadlift more, or you're starting to leverage more weight, you're still loading the spine with more weight in a fragile state, the risk of injury is going to be higher. It's just not worth it. And just think about if an injury did happen, how mad you would be. At the end of the day, we're on stage to present the hardest, grinniest looking physique. Nobody's up there being like, number 42, how much were you pressing 2 weeks out? Because nobody gives a shit. And at the end of the day, I mean, I can go ahead and make a broad statement. Usually the strongest bodybuilders aren't the best. They're just not.
Very, very seldom. I would venture to say that I probably maintain strength in this prep better than most, just because I'm getting better at that fatigue management each time I do it. But I guarantee I was not, I was probably the most conditioned in the class, or I had to have been pretty close. And
Yeah.
I definitely probably was not the strongest.
Yeah, no, that's something. That's
Not
exactly
by
what I'm
then.
saying, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
It's where, and that's another whole other conversation we'll have another time where, as a coach, really trying to get somebody to understand bodybuilding training, the purposes of each phase, and really letting go of that ego, because as we all know, there are some, even my friends. I mean, James Hollinshead, I'll tell you a story about him in a second. It's a highlight reel on Instagram, right? People are going to post their best lifts. And to the general viewer, they're like, oh my God, that's how they're training all the time. No, they're not. I was on a podcast. We had James, a friend of mine, James Hollinshead, James, he's super strong, right?
absolutely.
And Milos gets on and Milos comments negatively about his training. And James is like, Milos, I don't train like that all the time. That's legitimately like 5% of the time.
Right.
He goes, that's for the Instagram. I like to do it because he goes, I know it's dangerous. He goes, I know what it potentially could do. I know it's not necessary. He goes, but I do love lifting heavy. It's part of what I love to do. And I'm not going to stop doing what I love to do. I understand the risks. He goes, but the majority of the time, I'm not training like that at all. It's controlled motions, maximizing mechanical tension, staying with hack squat, leg press, and other things. And Milos is like, oh, because of Instagram. And James is like, dude, it's the highlight reel,
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of people see, thinking that's what they're doing every week. Safety bar squat, 10 plates every week. No, they're not doing that,
Right.
and that's a hard habit to break with a lot of clients, with letting go of that ego, because it does look cool to bench 4 or 5 for 10 reps in the gym, it
Sure.
does, but in hindsight, I mean, we look at the Dexter Jackson, some of the bodybuilders who've made it the longest with the least injuries, and they're never coming anywhere close to crazy loads. I remember the first time I watched Dennis Wolf squat and Dexter, I was so disappointed, because I used
Right.
to watch Ronnie Coleman squat, right? And I'm like, why is Dennis Wolf only squatting 365? And in the video, it's like the strictest perfect ankle mobility, forward knee motion, sitting into the hole, loading the quad, not the
Oh,
hip,
beautiful stuff.
just beautiful repetitions. And I remember him talking about, like, it's about stimulating the muscle. And I'm like, what is this guy talking about? Like, and not understanding that until I gotten older, I've gotten injured, unfortunately. Sometimes it's the school of hard knocks, right? You got to learn from those dumb
For
mistakes
sure.
before we wake
Yep.
up. But that's a hard message to give a lot of people. And people will be like, oh, totally, you're just a pussy. Listen, man, until you get injured and you understand, you won't. But ultimately, this is bodybuilding. This isn't powerlifting. Yes, lifting heavyweight is fun. Let's be honest. If you can lift heavyweight, you're probably going to. But it's not a means to an all, especially if you're trying to bring up weak body parts and ultimately expand that expiration date in your body, right? We all have an expiration date in our body, and where that expiration date is greatly determined what we do with it.
Yeah. And there's maybe one more thing we can kind of touch on too with the prep and post show, that post show period as well. I think this is another easy, because I'm trying to give like some easy applicable little tidbits here. It's like a lot of times I'll see those digestive issues flare up a lot more post show, because what's really kind of saving people's ass during the prep is the fact that they're not eating much. That's the only thing that's preventing them from having astronomically worse digestive issues, is just they don't have very much food coming in. And then of course post show they binge, they eat all kinds of fucking junk, and
Bad food.
and yeah, and then boom, everything that was already there is awakened, right? And now it's already, it's flaring up. So post show is another important time to set up that off season for bodybuilders and understand that, yes, we don't need to drag out this reverse dieting process for super long unnecessary periods of time, because we want to get people feeling better and performing better. But also understand, like, post show, if you're lean, you're going to be insulin sensitive as hell, and you should fill out like a freaking maniac by just doing anything at that point. If you get lean enough, especially like this whole post show period, I don't know, for what's for April, so like 5 months post show, this kept getting fuller and fuller and fuller and fuller. I didn't even touch failure on anything until probably like a month ago. you
Recovery is
know
probably perfect.
Yeah, and of course, I just kind of was listening, and I kind of titrated up the intensity of my training as I was able to. And food wise, I was able to kind of move up at a decent rate, not overly quick, but at a rate that allowed me to keep growing. It wasn't this like I'm going to gain 40 pounds in, a month bullshit. Like that's not going to serve me at all.
Austin, I want to, we'll close it out. And I just want to give a synopsis of what we talked about. And I'm going to verbalize it, and then you can correct me if I missed anything. But what you just said, one thing I want people to take away from this too is bodybuilding's phases. It's not just get ripped and then just get jacked. There's in between phases that are important for the management of your body, going from off season into prep and going from prep into off season. There are important phases. I don't like when people say, oh, Chris, I feel like I'm not making any ground right now. I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is an important process to the next step. You can't take step 2 and 3 before you get to step 4 and 5. If you skip it, you're going to fall down the stairs. And you're ultimately going to be in a worse spot post show if you gain 40 pounds. And now all of a sudden, 10 weeks out post show, you're at 40 pounds. Now you're soft, you lost sensitivity, you're too fat, digestion's going to shit. And now you have inflammation in your joints and training, everything's falling apart. Sleep apnea is high. And now you're in a hole versus being 8 to 10 weeks post show. And you are still relatively lean, not super fat. Digestion is on point. Your body's ready. It's fresh. Your injuries are mitigated, and you're ready to go ahead into an off season. That is very important. But overall, guys, and what Austin said, and I know a lot more coaches are using this methodology of functional nutrition, is the bottom line is there's a time to pull back, and you need to know when to pull back. And you really should seek advice for somebody who is readily educated in this type of field to be able to restore your gut if you're having chronic digestive issues, because don't ignore them. Don't just throw Tums and Prilosec at it and all of a sudden just start limiting your diet more and more. Because see, a lot of people start to pigeonhole their diet. The more digestive issues they have, the less variety they have. And then over time, it gets worse and worse, and their gut microflora becomes less and less diverse. And then they're in a worse situation, and they dig themselves in a hole, and now they got to go way back out of that hole.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of useful information here, and unfortunately, people get very emotionally they get emotionally driven decisions, and they just want to push, push, push. Chris, I got to get jacked. I'm going to run Anadrol in the off season, and I'm going to throw in Tren in too. Well, how are you going to sleep? I don't know. I'll take a Valium, and then it's just a drug factory of which is not going to lead anywhere good. It's just not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But is there anything that, like, I mean, I could talk about this forever, Jay. I know you can too. Is there anything specific that really you want to tell everybody in your experience, or anything I missed?
Yeah, I mean, you summed it up really well, and without me giving a bunch of specific testing and all that stuff, I mean, I think the bottom line is that if you function better, you respond better, and that's and over a period of time, a bodybuilding lifespan, if you function better, you will. It's not a you. It's this is non-negotiable. You will make more progress, and there's a good handful of pros right now. Like I have a lot of the coaches I work with and stuff. Either it's their clients and we worked on them, or they know them from their gym or whatever. There's a good handful of guys right now, like I can tell you straight up, that are could do so much better if they would just learn this methodology or work with someone that knew how to manage it. But again, they just want to know what drugs to take and how much of them to take. And I'm like, it all has a time, it all has a place, but you have to understand the body's a system. Like we can't just cram a square peg into a round hole forever and expect to keep making progress. And then what happens? They get burnt out, they quit, they say bodybuilding sucks and it's fucking stupid, no one should do it. And you know, and then there you go.
Dude, I love bodybuilding. I live the lifestyle. Like, dude, I still live the lifestyle. I train only weights 3 times per week. The rest is mountain biking, rollerblading, boxing. But I still live it. I love it. I'm never going to stop because it's learning. But as you said, genetics reigns supreme in bodybuilding, and genetics have taken a lot of people very, very far. I know of a top pro who placed top 5 a couple of times, and I know firsthand they've never followed the prep and not cheated on their diet. And they used to run out of gear in the middle of their diet. I mean, run out of gear in the middle of their cycle and take breaks and restart and fall off their training and fall back on, and they still place.
Yeah.
Genetics reign supreme. But as you said, a lot of these guys, if they function better in all aspects, it's going to work physically and internally, right? Because we all know that structurally, a lot of bodybuilders they don't have the best ankle hip mobility, don't have good core strength, not able to really carry the movements they have. But Austin, listen, man, I know how valuable your time is. You got a lot of clients, very busy dude. Where can everybody find you? Instagram, anything you want to plug, your website, your courses you have?
Yeah, sure. So on my Instagram, it's Austin ST and then the number 8. You can find me there. Probably the easiest thing to do is I have a little link tree in my bio that'll link you to YouTube. I have literally hours of free content on there if you want to start learning base level of all this stuff. I advertise all my classes on there. If you're a coach, I do have a mentorship program, so I educate on all this stuff. Um, so yeah, hit that link tree. Any inquiries, my email's in my bio too. So email me, whether it's like I literally do GI consultations and lab work consultations, like at least like probably 5 to 10 a week.
That's awesome.
So yeah, so I mean, I can help with anything, whether it's long-term coaching, consults, whatever, all that stuff.
Awesome, man. It's a breath of fresh air to hear you speak, Austin. I know we've spoken briefly before on your live page. I know we have some mutual friends in the industry, Mr. Jewett there.
Yep,
But again, man, I really appreciate your time, dude. This is awesome. Dude, I could talk about this forever. I know you can too. But dude, I thank you again, man. And hopefully in the future we can have you on again for any more specific topics or anything like
absolutely.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, man. I really appreciate it.